Segment 1. The Rotten Reality of Garum. The scent hung heavy in the coastal air, a pungent cloud that announced itself long before you reached the source. Along the shores of ancient Rome's bustling ports, rows of large open vats baked under the Mediterranean sun. Inside them, fish entrails fermented slowly, breaking down into a thick, amber liquid that would grace the tables of every Roman home. This was garum, the condiment that defined Roman cuisine for centuries, a sauce so beloved that factories dedicated to its production lined the empire's shores from Spain to North Africa. The process was deceptively simple. Workers would layer fish intestines, blood, and small whole fish with generous amounts of salt in large clay containers. Then came the waiting, weeks or months of fermentation under the relentless sun, as enzymes slowly broke down the fish flesh into a protein-rich liquid. The stench was overwhelming, a miasma of rotting fish that permeated clothing, hair, and skin. So noxious were these garum factories that laws eventually restricted them to locations outside city limits, sparing urban dwellers from the worst of the odor. Yet this pungent sauce was no mere seasoning to the Romans. It was the foundation of their cuisine, as ubiquitous as salt is today. Wealthy patricians and humble plebeians alike reached for garum at nearly every meal, though the quality varied dramatically with one's social standing. The finest garum, made from the blood of mackerel, commanded prices that only the elite could afford. The poorest Romans made do with alec, the muddy sediment left behind after the liquid was strained. Still intensely fishy, but lacking the prized clarity and complexity of premium versions. What did it taste like, this cornerstone of Roman flavor? Not quite as offensive as its production might suggest. The long fermentation transformed the raw fishiness into something more complex. Intensely salty, yes, but also rich with umami. That elusive fifth taste that creates a sense of savory satisfaction. Modern chefs who have recreated ancient garum describe it as similar to Asian fish sauces, though more intense, with notes that might remind us of anchovy paste, soy sauce, and aged cheese all at once. But here is where Roman tastes diverge most sharply from our own. Garum went into everything. Sweet pastries were drizzled with the fish sauce. Fruits were macerated in it. Even the finest wines might receive a dash before serving. The Roman palate made no distinction between sweet and savory when it came to their beloved garum. A honey cake might arrive at the table glistening with the same sauce that seasoned your roasted dormouse or poached eggs. Imagine sitting down to a Roman feast, the low tables laden with dishes. Each bite you take, whether bread, meat, vegetable, or sweet, carries the same persistent undertone of fermented fish. By meal's end, your palate would know no respite from this singular flavor, your clothes and hair carrying home the lingering aroma that permeated the dining room. In the cramped apartments of Rome's urban poor, where cooking, eating, and sleeping all happened in the same small space, the smell of garum would have been a constant companion, inescapable and defining. Today, we might find echoes of garum in the fish sauces of Southeast Asia, or the colatura di alici still produced in small batches along Italy's Amalfi coast. But these modern condiments are used with a restrained hand, a subtle accent rather than the dominant flavor. The Roman relationship with garum speaks to something deeper about how taste and disgust are culturally constructed, how what repels one civilization might become the cornerstone of another's cuisine. The sauce that would make modern diners recoil was, to Roman palates, the very essence of good taste, a reminder that flavor is as much about time and place as it is about the food itself. Segment 2. Exotic and Unsettling Meats. In the quiet corners of wealthy Roman villas, special ceramic containers called gleraria stood in rows. Each jar featured small air holes and interior ramps, designed not for storage but as miniature homes. Inside these terracotta chambers lived dormice, not as pets, but as livestock being fattened for the table. Fed a diet of nuts and acorns in the darkness of their jars, these small rodents grew plump and ready for the cook's knife. When feast day arrived, they would be gutted, stuffed with pork mince and pine nuts, dipped in honey, and fried whole. The elite dinner guests would pop these mice into their mouths entirely, crunching through the small bones as they savored the sweet and savory flesh. The dormouse was but one entry in a catalog of meats that would unsettle the modern palate. While the common Roman subsisted largely on grains and vegetables, the wealthy explored the boundaries of edibility with a curiosity that often crossed into the realm of the bizarre. Status was displayed not merely through quantity, but through novelty and rarity. The more unusual or difficult to obtain the meat, the greater the host's prestige. Flamingo tongues appeared on the finest tables, carefully extracted from birds imported at great expense from North Africa. Peacocks were prized not only for their spectacular feathers, which might be arranged to fan out impressively around the cooked bird, but for their flesh, which Apicius, Rome's most famous gourmet, ranked as the finest meat for making meatballs. Songbirds like thrushes and ortolans were caught in great numbers, fattened in special aviaries, then roasted and consumed whole, their tiny bones adding a delicate crunch to each bite. Even more unsettling to modern sensibilities was the Roman fondness for animal parts we now discard. Sows' wombs, particularly from animals that had never given birth, were considered a supreme delicacy. Udders, brains, testicles, and other organs featured prominently in elite cuisine. Apicius provides recipes for stuffed pig stomach, boiled parrot, and stewed crane, all prepared with complex sauces that often combined honey, wine, garum, and dozens of spices. For the wealthy Roman, the exotic nature of these foods was precisely the point. To serve parrot or flamingo was to display one's connections to distant parts of the empire, one's wealth that could command such rarities. The consumption of these unusual meats was a performance of power as much as an act of nourishment. Meanwhile, the average Roman citizen would pass by the butcher's stall with longing, perhaps affording a small piece of pork or sausage once a week. Meat remained a luxury for most, with religious festivals providing rare opportunities for communal consumption of sacrificial animals. The stark contrast between daily fare and elite excess was never more apparent than in the realm of flesh foods. While one class debated the merits of peacock versus flamingo, another subsisted on porridge and vegetables, with meat appearing only on special occasions. This disparity extended to quality as well as quantity. When ordinary Romans did consume meat, it was often the tougher cuts from older animals, requiring long stewing to become palatable. The wealthy, by contrast, demanded tender flesh from young animals, prepared with skill and artistry by trained cooks. Even in the preparation of the same animal, the experience could differ dramatically depending on one's social position. What connects us to these ancient diners across the centuries is not their specific tastes, but the universal human tendency to use food as a marker of identity and status. Today's food trends and taboos may differ in content, but they serve the same social function as the exotic meats of ancient Rome, signaling who we are, where we belong, and how we wish to be perceived. The dormouse in its clay jar reminds us that what we find disturbing to eat is rarely about nutrition or flavor, but about the stories we tell ourselves about what food is proper, prestigious, or permissible. Segment 3. The daily grind of grain. Dawn breaks over the ancient city, and already the sound of grinding stones fills the air. In small apartments and humble dwellings throughout Rome, women bend over handmills, the rotary querns turning with each push as they convert hard grain kernels into the flour that will sustain their families. The work is exhausting, the stone heavy against calloused palms. With each rotation, fine dust rises, not just of flour, but of the stone itself, wearing away imperceptibly with each use, adding mineral grit to the daily bread. For most Romans throughout the Republic and Empire, life was measured out in servings of grain. The staple food that formed the foundation of nearly every meal was pulse, a simple porridge made from cracked emmer wheat or spelt, boiled in water with perhaps a touch of salt, and, if one was fortunate, a drizzle of olive oil. This humble dish had sustained Romans since the earliest days of their civilization, eaten morning and evening, day after day, with such monotonous regularity that wealthy Romans would later define themselves precisely by how far they had moved beyond this peasant fare. The grinding itself introduced the first of many problems. Stone mills left behind particles of stone dust that became incorporated into the flour. Each bite of bread contained minute fragments of stone that gradually wore down the teeth. Examine the remains of ordinary Romans, and you'll find molars ground flat years before their time, the enamel worn away by a lifetime of chewing not just food, but the very earth itself. Bread production brought its own complications. For the poor, dark bread was the norm, made from coarse flour that retained all the bran and germ of the wheat. While more nutritious than the refined white bread favored by the elite, it was also more susceptible to contamination. Insect eggs, rodent droppings, and fungal spores all found their way into the community ovens where these loaves were baked. In times of shortage, millers and bakers might extend their flour with all manner of fillers, sawdust, ground bean meal, or even chalk, creating loaves that filled the belly but provided little nourishment. The wealthy, by contrast, demanded bread of the purest white, made from wheat that had been sifted through fine cloth to remove any hint of bran. Slaves would spend hours separating the lightest portion of the flour for their masters' tables. This refined bread, while visually appealing and easier to digest, was stripped of much of its nutritional value, a pattern of privileging appearance over substance that would continue for centuries in European bread-making. For many urban poor, even baking bread at home was impossible. Their cramped apartment blocks, the infamous insulae that rose 6 or 7 stories high, rarely had private cooking facilities. Instead, they relied on food stalls and bakeries, bringing their dough to community ovens or purchasing pre-made loaves. These commercial operations varied wildly in their standards of cleanliness and quality control. A loaf bought from a street vendor might contain anything from weevils to ash. The state recognized the critical importance of grain to social stability. The phrase "bread in circuses" was more than metaphorical. Actual grain distributions to citizens became a cornerstone of Roman public policy. By the imperial period, the annona system provided free or subsidized grain to hundreds of thousands of Romans. These distributions helped prevent starvation, but did little to improve variety or quality. The recipients still faced the daily monotony of pulse and rough bread, their diet distinguished from that of slaves only by its reliability rather than its diversity or flavor. Even the preparation of this simple fare was fraught with difficulty. Cooking was done over open fires that filled small apartments with smoke. Water had to be carried from public fountains. Fuel was expensive and scarce. The resulting meals were often half-cooked, bitter with smoke, and eaten lukewarm as families huddled around a single pot. There's a certain poignancy in the fact that Rome, with its architectural marvels and military might, with its vast territories and sophisticated legal system, never managed to provide its common citizens with anything more than the most basic sustenance. The empire that could build the Colosseum and span rivers with magnificent bridges still left most of its people to subsist on porridge and bread, day after unchanging day. In the contrast between the engineering genius of Roman aqueducts and the dreary monotony of the plebeian diet, we see perhaps the most enduring paradox of this ancient civilization, capable of greatness, yet unable to translate its achievements into daily comfort for the majority of its people. Segment 4. Preservation Nightmares. The Mediterranean sun beat down mercilessly on the open-air markets of Rome, where fish, meat, and produce lay exposed to the elements. In the heat, the transformation was swift and inevitable. Fish eyes clouded over within hours. Meat developed a sheen and a sweetish odor. Fruits softened and fermented where they sat. In a world without refrigeration, food existed in a constant race against decay, a race that humans often lost. The Romans developed an elaborate arsenal of preservation techniques, each introducing its own compromise to flavor, texture, and wholesomeness. Salt was the primary weapon against spoilage, applied liberally to nearly everything that needed to keep. Fish were packed in salt, so dense it drew out all moisture, leaving behind stiff, desiccated flesh that bore little resemblance to its fresh state. Meat was similarly treated, often becoming so salty that it required soaking in multiple changes of water before it could be made edible. Even then, the overwhelming saltiness dominated any dish it entered, masking subtle flavors and leaving diners perpetually thirsty. Smoking offered another defense, infusing foods with compounds that deterred bacterial growth. Cheeses, meats, and fish hung in smoke-filled rooms until they were thoroughly permeated with the protective haze. The resulting flavor was powerful and distinctive, not unpleasant perhaps, but omnipresent in the Roman diet. The taste of smoke, like the taste of salt, became so common that foods without these notes might have seemed bland or incomplete to the ancient palate. Fermentation provided yet another strategy, harnessing controlled decay to prevent more dangerous forms of decomposition. Vegetables were submerged in brine to create pickles that could last for months. Cabbage became sauerkraut, cucumbers turned into pickles, and turnips transformed into something akin to modern kimchi. Wine, of course, was fermented grape juice, but even it was unstable. Without modern sealing and sterilization techniques, wine quickly turned to vinegar, especially in warmer months. Many Romans drank their wine young, accepting its rough character as the price of avoiding sourness. Perhaps most troubling to modern sensibilities was the Roman use of lead acetate, known as sapa or defrutum, as a preservative and sweetener. Created by boiling wine in lead pots until it reduced to a syrup, this substance added a deceptive sweetness to foods while introducing a steady stream of lead into the Roman diet. The resulting chronic lead poisoning may have contributed to infertility, cognitive impairment, and a host of other health problems among those wealthy enough to regularly consume preserved foods and wines treated with this toxic sweetener. Storage containers themselves introduced further complications. Porous ceramic amphorae allowed slow oxidation of their contents. Wooden barrels imparted their own flavors and harbored microorganisms from previous uses. Open storage invited insects. Weevils infested grain. Flies laid eggs on drying meat, and mice helped themselves to anything accessible. The Romans accepted a level of insect contamination in their food that would horrify modern consumers. Pliny the Elder offered practical advice not on how to prevent weevils in stored grain, but on the best time to harvest, so that the larvae would not yet have reached their full size. Even the wealthy, with their vast resources, could not fully escape these preservation challenges. Their elaborate dinner parties featured dishes made from ingredients in various states of preservation. Fresh vegetables might appear alongside salted fish, pickled olives, and smoked meats, creating flavor combinations that were as much about masking incipient spoilage as they were about culinary artistry. The famous garum sauce served multiple purposes beyond flavor. Its high salt content and fermented nature made it both a condiment and a preservative when drizzled over other foods. For the poor, the challenges were even greater. Without slaves to shop daily for fresh ingredients, without cool cellars for storage, they relied heavily on the most aggressively preserved foods, the hardest cheeses, the saltiest fish, the sourest wine. Their palates adjusted to these intense flavors out of necessity rather than choice. What we might perceive as unpalatable was, for them, simply the taste of survival. In this constant battle against decay, we could see the origins of many traditional Mediterranean flavors that persist today. The fermented tang of cheese, the saline punch of cured meats, the acidic brightness of pickled vegetables. What began as preservation necessity eventually became culinary preference, as generations developed tastes shaped by the limitations of their food storage technology. The very flavors that were born of compromise have, ironically, become the authentic tastes we now seek to preserve in traditional cuisines. A reminder that necessity has always been the mother of culinary invention. Segment 5. The missing ingredients. Picture the most iconic Italian dish you can imagine, perhaps a pizza margherita, its surface bright with tomato sauce, or a plate of pasta dressed in a rich tomato ragu. Now erase the tomato entirely. Imagine Italian cuisine without the sweet acidity of this fundamental ingredient. This was the reality of ancient Rome, where tomatoes, native to the Americas, were entirely unknown. The absence of tomatoes is just one example of how Roman cuisine lacked many ingredients we now consider essential to Mediterranean cooking. The culinary geography of the ancient world was fundamentally different from our own. The Columbian Exchange, that vast transfer of plants, animals, culture, and ideas between the Americas and the Old World, lay nearly 15 centuries in the future when Rome was at its height. This meant that Roman cooks had never encountered tomatoes, potatoes, corn, bell peppers, chili peppers, vanilla, chocolate, or many varieties of beans. The absence of these New World foods created a cuisine that would seem strangely incomplete to modern Italian diners. Consider the potato, that humble staple that now feeds billions worldwide. Roman farmers knew nothing of this versatile tuber. Instead, they relied on turnips, parsnips, and other root vegetables that required more careful cooking and offered less sustaining starch. The sweet potato, too, was missing from their fields and tables. Corn, which now feeds much of the world's livestock and provides the polenta of northern Italian cuisine, was similarly absent. The Roman sweet tooth knew nothing of chocolate, that complex, bittersweet flavor we now take for granted. Their desserts relied primarily on honey for sweetness. As sugar cane was rare and expensive when available at all, honey has its charm, certainly, but its distinctive flavor permeated every sweet dish, offering little of the variety we enjoy today. Fruits provided additional sweetness, but even here, the selection was limited compared to our global markets. Citrus fruits were rare luxury items rather than common ingredients, with lemons particularly scarce. Perhaps most significant was the absence of many spices that now define global cuisine. Black pepper was known but extremely expensive, worth its weight in silver and used sparingly even by the wealthy. Chili peppers, with their range of heat and flavor, were entirely unknown, leaving Roman cooks without this entire dimension of taste. Vanilla, nutmeg, cloves, and many other spices either hadn't reached the Mediterranean or were so costly that only the most extravagant could afford them. In place of these now common ingredients, Romans relied heavily on a spice that has since disappeared entirely: silphium. This plant, a type of giant fennel native to a small region of North Africa, was so prized for its flavor that it was harvested to extinction. The Romans loved it so much that its seed pod shape may have evolved into our modern heart symbol. When supplies dwindled, they substituted asafoetida, a resin with a powerful garlic-like aroma so pungent it's still called devil's dung in some languages. These flavors, central to Roman cuisine, would seem strange and overwhelming to modern palates. The absence of coffee and tea meant that Romans had no access to these beloved morning beverages. Instead, they started their days with watered wine or water infused with herbs. Pleasant enough, perhaps, but lacking the comforting ritual and caffeine boost that many now consider essential to beginning the day. The social spaces that would later develop around coffee and tea drinking, the cafes and tea houses, had no equivalent in Roman society. What the Romans did have was an intimate knowledge of local herbs, vegetables, and fruits. Their cuisine made creative use of what was available: lovage, mint, coriander, dill, celery seed, and rue appeared frequently in recipes. They cultivated dozens of varieties of lettuce, cabbage, and other greens. They understood fermentation, producing wines, vinegars, and pickled vegetables with skill. Within the constraints of their ingredient list, they created complex and varied dishes. Yet there remains something poignant about this cuisine frozen in time, developing in isolation from the global exchange of flavors that would later transform it. The Romans never knew how their cooking might have evolved had they encountered the tomato or the potato. They never experienced the heat of chili peppers or the complexity of chocolate. Their world of flavor was simultaneously sophisticated within its boundaries and limited by what we would now consider a restricted palette of ingredients. In this absence, we can see how profoundly food connects to time and place, how the accidents of geography and history shape what we consider normal or essential in our diets. The Roman table, missing so many ingredients we take for granted, reminds us that cuisine is never static, but always evolving, always incorporating new elements while sometimes losing old ones. Silphium is gone forever, but tomatoes and potatoes have found their way into Mediterranean cooking as if they had always belonged there. The story of food is one of constant change, of loss and discovery, a living history written in the ingredients we pass from hand to hand across generations and continents.